All right, welcome to the deep dive. We sift through a ton of information, find those hidden gems, and, well, bring them straight to you. It's basically like a crash course on, actually knowing stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Today, we're going deep, really deep, into the world of aspirin.
For this deep dive, we've looked at so much material. Like, we've gone all the way back to how aspirin was even discovered.
Wow.
We've dug into the regulations, the science, even how aspirin is seen by, society at large.
So like the whole 9 yards.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's amazing.
The goal here is to uncover the complete story of aspirin, and that's from its ancient roots to its impact, in our lives today. And trust me, there are going to be some surprises along the way.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, aspirin is something we kind of all just have around, right? Like in our medicine cabinets.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous.
But where did this all even begin? Like, seriously, back to the basics.
Well, the story goes back way further than most people realize. Okay, so the active ingredients in aspirin, they're these things called salicylic acid derivatives. Okay. And you know what? People have been using these for pain relief for thousands of years. It's really fascinating.
No way, really?
Oh, yeah. You have ancient Sumerian and Egyptian texts, stuff like the Eber's Papyrus mentioning willow tree extracts.
Willow. Like the
Yeah.
tree.
Yep, exactly.
Oh, huh?
They were using those to fight pain and fever, just like we do today.
So they were already using willow bark back then. Wow.
And it goes on even in ancient Greece, like Hippocrates, the big name in medicine, even he recommended willow bark tea.
For fever.
Yeah, fever. 5th century BCE we're talking, so you can see what we know as aspirin today. It has these incredibly deep roots.
So like centuries of just using natural raw aspirin. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely.
When did we actually make aspirin in a lab,
The first deliberate creation of acetylsalicylic acid, ASA, was in 1853.
ASA.
Yeah, another name for aspirin.
Gotcha.
A French chemist named Charles Frederick Gerhardt did it.
Okay.
He reacted sodium salicylate with acetyl chloride, boom, ASA.
So he made it, but then nothing happened.
Yeah, he didn't really try to market it or anything. It was just kind of, a lab experiment.
Okay, so we had the discovery, but not the medicine. That's where Bayer steps in, right?
Yeah,
The aspirin company.
yeah, Bayer in 1897, they wanted to make salicylate-based drugs, but with less irritation. And one of their chemists, Felix Hoffmann, working under Arthur Eichengrun, they managed to synthesize this pure, stable form of ASA.
And this one actually worked well.
It did. This was the form that was really good at relieving pain and fever, yeah.
There was some debate about who really discovered it, wasn't there?
Yeah, there's a bit of a historical mystery there.
Yeah.
Decades later, Eichengrun said he was the one calling the shots, that Hoffman's role was, well, less important. Historians are still debating that, but either way, Bayer ran with it, right?
Developed it further.
Yep.
And that's where the name aspirin comes from, I guess.
You got it.
Yeah.
Bayer trademarked aspirin in 1899.
1899.
A from acetyl, spir is from spirea.
Spirea, what is that?
It's meadowsweet, a plant with salicin in it. And the in ending, well, that was super common for medicines back then. And, the same year, 1899, Bayer starts selling aspirin, gives info to doctors, and boom, it becomes a global bestseller. Pretty amazing.
It's kind of crazy how a brand name just becomes part of our language.
Absolutely.
Aspirin. They said, well, aspirin.
Everyone knows it.
From a powder to a little pill. That was a big
Oh,
deal.
no, absolutely. At first, it was sold as a powder, which was kind of messy. But then in 1900, they made it into those tablets.
Much easier.
So much easier.
Makes sense why it got even more popular.
Yeah. And a lot of places, you didn't even need a prescription. Plus, it got added to the, the official drug list, the pharmacopoeias.
So huge success right out of the gate. But I'm guessing that didn't last forever. Didn't they have those aspirin wars?
Yeah, you're right. The 1920s and 30s, things got really competitive. After World War I, the aspirin trademark got lost in a bunch of countries.
Really?
It became a generic name.
So anyone could make it.
Pretty much, yeah. And companies like Sterling Drug jumped in big time. They even bought Bayer's U.S. operations for a while.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a real battle for market share. Aggressive marketing, lawsuits, you name it. All because this drug was making a ton of money.
Makes sense. And then what happened in the mid-20th century? Weren't there new pain relievers then?
Right. You had acetaminophen hitting the scene in 1956.
Tylenol.
Yep, and then ibuprofen in 62.
Advil, Motrin.
Exactly. And people felt those are easier on their stomachs, so some switched over from aspirin for everyday pain.
So aspirin took a bit of a hit, but Wait, didn't it have a comeback?
It did, and a big one.
How did that happen?
It's a story of, scientific discovery. In 1971, a British pharmacologist, so John Vane, he figured out that aspirin actually works by inhibiting something on cyclooxygenase, COX for short.
TOX, okay.
That's an enzyme that's crucial for making prostaglandins, which cause inflammation, pain, and fever.
So aspirin shuts that down.
Basically, yeah. That discovery finally explained what people had been observing for centuries.
And didn't he win a Nobel Prize for that?
Absolutely, in 1982.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, and his research didn't stop there. It also revealed that aspirin can thin the blood, preventing blood clots. And that's because it blocks the production of thromboxane, which makes platelets sticky and likely to clump together.
So that's the key to his heart benefits.
Exactly. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were these massive clinical trials proving aspirin's power to prevent blood clots.
Wow.
This led to it becoming widely used for, reducing heart attacks and stroke risk. It's worth noting, though, that a lot of those early trials mostly used men. It's a problem, right? It took a while, but that sparked some really important changes in how medical research is done to make it more inclusive.
That's important. But so by the late 20th century, aspirin was basically reborn, right? From pain relief to preventing heart problems.
Yeah, it became a cornerstone of cardiovascular disease prevention. It really was a renaissance for aspirin. It went from willow bark to, going to the moon with the Apollo astronauts.
Wait, really? The moon?
Yeah, and it even got into the Guinness Book of World Records. Not bad for a little pill.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how doctors actually use aspirin today.
Okay, so aspirin is a versatile medication with a few main uses. It's great for mild to moderate pain, things like tension headaches, dental pain, muscle aches.
Okay.
It's also an antipyretic, meaning it lowers fever in adults.
So it tackles pain and fever.
Yeah, and here's an interesting thing. Aspirin combined with caffeine, that combo boosts pain relief, which is why you see it in some migraine meds.
Makes sense.
For those tension headaches, aspirin by itself or with other painkillers is often the first choice for treatment. It can also help with migraine attacks, especially when you team it up with acetaminophen and caffeine.
But isn't there like a big warning about using it with kids?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Aspirin generally isn't recommended for children or teens who have a fever or, those viral illnesses like the flu or chickenpox.
Okay.
There's a risk of this rare but serious condition called Ray's syndrome.
Oh, right. I've heard of that.
Back in 1986, the FDA made it mandatory to put warning labels on all aspirin products about this risk. Since then, aspirin use in kids has dropped significantly, which is good, and thankfully, so have the cases of Ray's syndrome. So when you hear baby aspirin now, it usually means the low-dose aspirin adults take for heart health, not for kids' pain or fever.
So definitely important to remember that distinction. Now, what about aspirin as an anti-inflammatory? I know it's used for that too.
Yeah, you're right. Higher doses of aspirin have those anti-inflammatory properties. In the past, it was a main treatment for chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and rheumatic fever. It helps with joint pain, swelling, and inflammation. But the problem is, those high doses needed for this can cause more side effects, especially in the stomach. So nowadays, doctors tend to go for other NSAIDs, those are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, for long-term use because they're generally safer. But aspirin still has its place. It's used for things like acute rheumatic fever and pericarditis, where both its anti-inflammatory and anti-clotting actions are helpful.
So it's still in the game.
Definitely. And there's another unique situation, Kawasaki disease.
Kawasaki disease.
It's a rare inflammatory illness that affects children.
Okay.
And aspirin is used alongside intravenous immunoglobulin therapy.
So even though it's usually not for kids, there are exceptions.
Yeah, in this specific case, the benefits outweigh the risks. It helps reduce fever and prevents complications with the coronary arteries.
Interesting. And of course, we can't forget its role in preventing those cardiovascular events.
Right, that's where aspirin has really shined. Low-dose aspirin, usually 75 to 100 milligrams a day, it works by stopping those platelets from sticking together. Tiny cells in your blood that form clots.
Oh, right.
So by thinning the blood, it helps prevent those dangerous clots that can cause heart attacks and ischemic strokes. It's a standard treatment for people who have already had a heart attack, unstable angina, and ischemic stroke, or if they've been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease.
Secondary prevention, right?
Yeah. For those higher risk folks, low-dose aspirin every day significantly reduces the risk of another event. And the benefits, they usually outweigh the slightly increased risk of bleeding.
So, pretty clear benefits there. What about preventing a first heart attack or stroke, though?
So that's primary prevention, and it's a bit more complex.
Yeah.
It used to be that doctors would recommend a daily low-dose baby aspirin to pretty much everyone as a preventative measure. But then around 2018, a bunch of big studies, Arise, Ascend, Aspirin, they showed that for people without a history of heart problems, the benefits of aspirin weren't as big as initially thought, and they could be outweighed by the bleeding risk.
Oh, interesting. So the advice changed.
Yeah, guidelines became more selective. For example, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, they now recommend that for adults between 40 and 59 with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, the decision to start aspirin should be made on a case-by-case basis with their doctor. And they also now advise against starting aspirin for primary prevention for people 60 or older.
So not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope, not at all. The focus now is on a personalized approach. You gotta weigh the risk of a heart attack or stroke against the risk of bleeding.
So are there other potential uses for aspirin that are being researched?
Oh, there are a few things.
Like what?
Well, some studies suggest that taking low-dose aspirin over a long time might reduce the risk of colorectal cancer in certain people.
Really? Cancer?
Yeah, it's still being researched, but it could be that aspirin's anti-inflammatory effects have something to do with it.
That's fascinating.
It's actually led to some recommendations for low-dose aspirin in middle-aged folks who are at higher risk for both heart disease and colorectal cancer.
Double whammy prevention.
Exactly. And there's more. Aspirin might also help prevent preeclampsia during pregnancy.
Preeclampsia.
It's a serious condition that can develop during pregnancy.
Oh, okay.
Low-dose aspirin is now recommended for high-risk women. There's even research on aspirin's possible benefits for neurodegenerative diseases and psychiatric disorders where inflammation seems to play a role.
Interesting.
Though the evidence for things like Alzheimer's and dementia is still pretty inconclusive.
Still more to learn.
Oh, absolutely. Plus, aspirin's in all sorts of combination meds for migraines and colds, too. And don't forget, it's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, which means it's considered fundamental for basic healthcare around the world.
So, really a powerhouse of a drug. But how do they even make aspirin, like on a large scale?
The process is surprisingly straightforward. It all starts with a chemical reaction called esterification of salicylic acid.
Okay, so break that down for me.
So on an industrial scale, they usually begin with salicylic acid. Often that's made from phenol through something called the Kolbe-Schmidt reaction.
Right.
But the key step is reacting that salicylic acid with acetic anhydride.
The acetic anhydride.
Yeah, it's the thing that adds an acetyl group to the salicylic acid molecule. This reaction usually needs an acid catalyst, something like sulfuric or phosphoric acid, to speed it up. And that reaction creates, aspirin.
Aspirin, got it.
The chemical name is acetylsalicylic acid. And it also creates acetic acid as a byproduct.
Okay.
The basic equation looks like this. Salicylic acid plus acetic anhydride with an acid catalyst gives you acetylsalicylic acid plus acetic acid.
So it's like a chemistry 101 reaction.
Exactly. In fact, it's a common experiment in college chem labs.
Wow, cool.
But once the reaction is done, you need to separate and purify the aspirin, which is done through crystallization.
Crystallization.
You cool the mixture, and the aspirin forms these crystals that can be filtered out and washed. To get it really pure, they often do a second round of crystallization using different solvents.
So like a double filter.
Yeah, you could say that.
Makes sense. Quality control's got to be super important with medicine.
Well, for sure. Aspirin makers have strict quality control measures in place.
So like how do they do that?
They test things like how quickly the tablets dissolve, because that affects how the body absorbs the medicine. They also measure exactly how much of the active ingredient is present using techniques like titration or HPLC.
HPLC.
Yeah, high-performance liquid chromatography. It's basically a very precise way of separating and identifying every component in a mixture. It's a way to make absolutely sure that it's pure aspirin.
So like no extra stuff.
Exactly. And they also test for impurities, especially free salicylic acid, because that can be irritating. There are these official standards, like the United States Pharmacopoeia, that outline all the tests and limits aspirin has to meet.
Sounds pretty rigorous.
Yeah, it is. Luckily, because the process is so simple and has been around for so long, aspirin production is very reliable and cheap, which makes it accessible globally. It's funny, even with a drug this well studied, there are still discoveries. Like in 2005, they found a second crystalline form of aspirin, although that didn't really change how we use it.
Wow, that's wild.
But yeah, aspirin manufacturing is a great example of efficient production that makes this medicine affordable and accessible for people all over.
From a simple reaction to serious quality control, that's Quite a journey. Now, what about the regulations? Like, how is aspirin regulated given how old it is?
Well, that's an interesting
I
story.
bet.
Because when Bayer introduced it, back in 1899, modern drug regulations didn't exist. Early
Okay.
laws, like the 1906 Food and Drugs Act in the U.S., they were mainly about honest labeling, not proving how well something worked.
Oh, wow.
Aspirin just kind of took off based on its obvious benefits and got listed in those official drug lists, the pharmacopoeias, around the world.
So it's kind of grandfathered in.
Yeah, by the time tougher regulations came around in the U.S., like the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendments, aspirin was already considered an old drug, already seen as safe and effective for what it was used for.
So it kind of skipped the usual approval process?
Yeah, pretty much. In the U.S., the FDA mainly oversees aspirin as an over-the-counter or OTC drug.
The OTC, right?
And it's regulated under the FDA's OTC monograph system for analgesic, antipyretic, and antirheumatic drugs.
That's a mouthful.
I know, right?
Hmm.
But basically, that system sets the rules for selling aspirin over the counter, like what doses are okay, what you can use it for, and what warnings need to be on the label.
Okay.
Each company doesn't have to get separate approval for their product as long as they follow those rules.
Makes sense.
But they still need to meet the quality standards, and the labeling needs those FDA-mandated warnings, like the one about Ray's syndrome in kids, possible allergies, and the stomach bleeding risk.
Right, the usual warnings.
Yeah, a lot of countries have similar OTC regulations.
What about when they discovered new uses for aspirin, like for preventing heart attacks? How did the regulations handle that?
As the research built up showing aspirin's value for heart health, regulators had to figure out how to get this info out there.
To doctors and patients?
Yeah, exactly. The FDA in the U.S., they allowed labels that mentioned aspirin's role in secondary prevention, preventing another heart attack or stroke in people who'd already had one.
Okay.
So that new info from the studies became part of the official guidelines. Low-dose aspirin became a standard recommendation, even though it was still an OTC drug.
So, like, doctors could prescribe it, but you didn't need a prescription to buy it.
Yeah, that's right. You started seeing heart-healthy aspirin being advertised, usually with a note to talk to your doctor first.
Right, right.
But when it came to primary prevention, preventing a first heart attack, regulators were more careful.
Okay.
In 2014, the FDA rejected Bayer's request to market aspirin specifically for primary prevention because they weren't convinced the benefits outweighed the bleeding risks for everyone.
So being cautious.
Yeah, they wanted really strong evidence to justify a broader use for something that was so easily available.
Makes sense. Are there, like, different rules for aspirin in different countries?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
How so?
In some European countries, low-dose aspirin for heart health, it's actually prescription only.
Really?
Yeah, it's to make sure a doctor is involved in that decision, assessing risks and all that. But higher doses for pain, those might be OTC.
So it's like aspirin for your heart is taken more seriously than aspirin for a headache.
Yeah, you could say that.
Interesting.
In the UK, for instance, you might find the low-dose aspirin behind the counter, but the higher dose for pain is just out on the shelves. It's all about balancing access with medical oversight.
Makes sense.
And then you've got those medical guidelines from groups like the European Society of Cardiology and the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. These aren't laws, but doctors rely on them to know when to recommend aspirin.
So, like, expert advice.
Exactly. And globally, aspirin is still on that WHO list of essential medicines, which means it's seen as fundamental for basic health care worldwide.
So it's pretty widely accepted as an important drug.
Absolutely. And the way it's regulated keeps evolving, constantly being monitored and reassessed based on new evidence and safety concerns. So you could say that aspirin's approval has been more of a gradual process over decades, building up this understanding of its benefits and risks.
So it's not just a one-time thing. It's constantly evolving.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense. Well, let's move on to some of the controversies and legal issues around aspirin. It can't all be smooth sailing with a drug that's been around this long, right?
You're right. Aspirin has had its fair share of controversies and legal battles.
Like what?
One of the first big ones was about the name aspirin itself.
Really? The name?
Yep. Remember how Bayer lost the trademark in a bunch of countries after World War I? Well, in the U.S., aspirin became a generic term in the early 1920s. So tons of companies started selling acetylsalicylic acid, all calling it aspirin. Those were the aspirin wars, a lot of competition.
Wild.
Bayer had to sell its aspirin under different names in the U.S. for years. It wasn't until 1994 that they spent a lot of money to get back the U.S. trademark rights for aspirin. It's actually pretty unusual for a medicine to have this double life, being a trademark in some places and a generic name in others.
That's weird. What about safety concerns? I know there were some issues with kids.
Yeah, the link between aspirin and Ray's syndrome, that was a huge issue.
Ray's syndrome, right?
In the 70s and early 80s, research showed that kids who took aspirin after having a viral infection like the flu or chickenpox had a higher risk of getting Ray's syndrome.
It's pretty serious, right?
Yeah, it's rare, but it can be fatal.
Oh, wow.
It affects the brain and liver. So, health officials warned everyone, and in 1986, the FDA made it a rule that all aspirin products had to have a warning label saying not to give it to kids or teens with viral fevers. And similar warnings went out worldwide. Some parents even sued the companies making aspirin because their kids got Ray's syndrome after taking it.
So it was a really big deal.
It was. Thankfully, after those warnings, aspirin use in kids dropped, and so did cases of Ray's syndrome. They stopped marketing baby aspirin for infants, and now that term basically means low-dose aspirin for adults' heart health.
That's good that they took action and things improved.
Definitely.
What other controversies have there been with aspirin?
Well, the risk of bleeding, especially in the stomach and sometimes hemorrhagic strokes, those have been ongoing concerns, particularly with long-term low-dose use. While it didn't always lead to lawsuits, it's definitely been a source of debate and some public confusion. There was a time when doctors recommended a daily low-dose aspirin to almost everyone to prevent heart problems. But then new research, especially those trials around 2018, showed that it was more complicated than that.
Right.
The benefits weren't as clear for people without a history of heart problems, and the bleeding risk was a bigger concern. So guidelines changed, and some got more restrictive.
So, like, less aspirin for prevention overall.
Yeah, that's the general trend. And you know what? The FDA actually warned Bayer in 2014 about marketing aspirin for primary prevention because of this.
Interesting.
It goes to show that the whole idea of balancing aspirin's benefits with its risks, it's an ongoing process. It needs clear communication from, experts to doctors and the public.
Definitely. Were there, like, big product recalls or anything like that with aspirin?
Surprisingly, aspirin has had a pretty clean record compared to some other drugs.
Oh.
I guess because its chemistry is simple and it's been around for so long, people really understand its properties well. But there have been a few isolated incidents, like during that Tylenol scare back in the 80s where people were tampering with the pills.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, there were a few copycat cases with aspirin and other OTC meds, too.
Wow, scary.
It wasn't a problem with aspirin itself, but it did lead to improvements in tamper-resistant packaging for all OTC drugs.
That makes sense.
And the FDA has sent warning letters to companies for selling aspirin combos that weren't properly approved or made claims they couldn't back up.
Oh.
Like in 2009, Bayer got in trouble for selling a mix of low-dose aspirin and calcium supplements, claiming it was good for heart health and preventing cancer, but they didn't have the research to prove it.
Ah. Okay.
So even with an old drug like aspirin, you got to follow the rules.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Any ethical controversies surrounding aspirin?
Well, one of the biggest ones involved research. A lot of those early big trials that showed how well aspirin worked for preventing heart problems, they mostly used men as participants.
Right, we talked about that.
Yeah. And those findings were then applied to everyone, including women. But later research showed that women might respond differently to aspirin. Like one study in 2005 found that aspirin didn't really protect women under 65 from a first heart attack, but it did lower their stroke risk.
Oh, so there are differences.
Yeah, and that lack of representation in those early studies was criticized, rightfully so.
I imagine so.
It actually helped push for big changes in how research is done. Now, places like the National Institutes of Health, they require researchers to include women and other underrepresented groups in their studies, unless there's a really good reason not to.
So aspirin kind of helped make research more inclusive.
In a way, yeah. It highlighted how leaving out certain groups can skew the results and lead to misleading conclusions.
Makes sense. Now, what about aspirin's impact on the economy and the market?
Oh, that's a whole other story. Aspirin has gone from being this highly profitable, patented drug in the early 1900s to, well, a pretty basic, low-cost commodity.
Ugh.
Like, making aspirin these days is dirt cheap, just pennies a pill. But the painkiller market globally, it's massive. Billions of dollars.
Huge.
Even though aspirin share has gone down a bit since acetaminophen and ibuprofen came along, it's still a big player, especially as an OTC drug.
So even if it's cheap to make, they sell a ton of it.
Exactly. And it's not just sold as aspirin. It's in loads of cold and flu meds, too, which means it's everywhere.
That's true. I never thought about that.
Even in the U.S., where most people buy it over the counter, millions of prescriptions for aspirin are written every year, and that doesn't even count the OTC sales.
So it's still a major player.
Definitely. For Bayer, aspirin was a gold mine back in the day, but then they lost those patent and trademark rights, and generic competition exploded, prices went way down. The aspirin wars in the 20s and 30s, that was all about companies trying to stand out in a crowded market, spending tons on advertising and tweaking their formulas a bit.
So it's a classic example of a brand name drug becoming a generic.
Exactly. But Bayer still makes money from the aspirin trademark, especially in countries where they still own it.
Okay.
When they got back the U.S. trademark in 1994, it was a big deal for them.
Right.
And now you see both brand name aspirin and generic acetylsalicylic acid, or ASA, on the shelves. It's interesting, even when the generic is chemically the same, some people still prefer the brand name and are willing to pay more.
I guess the name just has that power.
It does, and we see this with those heart-healthy aspirin products, too. It's just regular aspirin, but marketed differently.
Clever marketing.
Totally. Overall, aspirin's impact on the economy over the past 120 years has been massive. It was a key part of the growth of the pharmaceutical industry, and is still a vital, affordable medicine worldwide, especially in places where resources are limited.
Makes sense.
Even small changes in recommendations, like the shift in thinking about primary prevention, can have a ripple effect on the entire market for this drug.
It's amazing how much one drug can affect so many things.
I know, right?
Now, for the last part, let's talk about aspirin's impact on culture and society.